Colombia has declared a state of emergency.
Dozens of civilians have been injured in the violence and thousands displaced.
They tied me up, and they tied up my friend.
Back in 2016, the Norwegian Nobel Committee awarded that year's Nobel Peace Prize to Colombia's then-president, Juan Manuel Santos, heralding, quote, his resolute efforts to bring the country's more than 50-year-long civil war to an end, a war that has cost the lives of at least 220,000 Colombians and displaced close to 6 million people. The citation noted, correctly, that peace in Colombia was not quite a done deal. Colombia's people had narrowly rejected in a referendum the peace agreement President Santos proposed, perhaps unwilling to forgive quite so quickly the pestilential narco gangs which had wrought such terror.
Big majority of the FARC members are now.
Nevertheless, negotiations continued and hands were eventually shaken. And if you'd like to hear President Santos talk more about how he did it, you are commended to episode 343 of The Foreign Desk.
I had told the FARC, the rules of the game is there's no ceasefire. We continue the war until we have an agreement.
And episode 142 of The Big Interview.
The adversaries, you beat them. But you have to be able to realize that they are going to be your partners, your citizens, with whom you have to live with for the rest of your life if you want peace.
However, as events this week have wretchedly demonstrated, peace in Colombia remains a not altogether realized ambition. In northeastern Colombia, at least 100 people have been killed and tens of thousands displaced by renewed fighting. Colombia's current president, Gustavo Petro, himself a former teenage guerrilla with the group known as M19, has declared what is quaintly entitled a state of internal commotion. Less delicately, President Petro has said of the guerrillas chiefly responsible for this latest violence that they had, quote, chosen the path of war, and war they will have. At which point, time to meet the protagonists. The group chiefly responsible for the latest violence are the Ejército de Liberación Nacional, or National Liberation Army, generally known as the ELN. The ELN was founded circa the mid-1960s by Fabio Vázquez Castano, a former acolyte of Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, but has been commanded for much of its existence by a succession of excitable Catholic priests, notably Father Manuel Pérez Martínez, who until his death in 1998 appeared to believe that answers to the question, what would Jesus do, did not necessarily exclude kidnap, extortion, sabotage, and protection racketeering. The ELN's current leadership, according to the best guesses of Western intelligence services, is a cabal of veteran rebels who may spend at least as much time in Venezuela and Cuba as they do anywhere near the consequences of their actions. The ELN never quite got on board with the peace agreement which was supposed to have ended Colombia's conflict. They turned up for some talks and ceased fire from time to time, but sent a pretty unmistakable signal in 2019 with a suicide bomb attack on the National Police Academy in Bogotá. 21 people were killed. In more recent years, the ELN had been speaking sporadically to President Petro's administration. One of Petro's former M19 comrades, former Senator Vera Grabe, had been designated an interlocutor, but talks were suspended again in September after another ELN attack killed 2 Colombian soldiers and injured dozens more. Officially, at least, that channel can probably be considered once again closed. Which brings us to the question of why the ELN have closed it. The current fighting is not between the ELN and Colombia's military, at least if we take President Petro at his word, not yet. The ELN appear to have been squabbling with a faction called the 33rd Front, once associated with what was, prior to the peace deal, Colombia's biggest militant group, the Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia, that is, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, usually better known and very carefully pronounced as FARC. Though FARC did sign the peace deal and disarmed accordingly, a few implacable headbangers among their ranks, the 33rd Front among them, did not. As to what the ELN and the FARC holdouts are fighting over, listeners who suspect that this is not a high-minded philosophical dispute over arcane principles of Marxism-Leninism are to be commended for their intuition, if reprimanded for their cynicism. The ELN and the FARC remnants are waging a turf war for control of the drug trade. The region beset by the recent violence, Catatumbo, in the mountains along Colombia's border with Venezuela, produces around 15% of Colombia's coca crop, and given that Colombia is estimated to produce roughly 60% of the world's cocaine, this is a resource worth controlling. As President Petro well knows, however, doing anything about Colombia's cocaine industry or the thuggish militias who run it is not as simple as wielding superior military force. If it was, Colombia wouldn't have had to fight FARC for more than half a century. The ELN is believed to field around 6,000 soldiers, at least 6,000 people with guns, which, as any counterinsurgency expert will wearily confirm, is plenty sufficient to occupy a national army, especially when they know the terrain and are unconcerned with legal and ethical niceties or whether they all look like nice guys in press reports. Colombia's narco-guerrillas may fall into that category of problems which are, at best, manageable rather than solvable. So long as there remains a demand for cocaine among citizens of wealthy countries, indifferent to the suffering they are funding, ruthless people will be willing to kill to supply it. For Monocle Radio, I'm Andrew Mueller.